the next of our key scenes would be actually to Act 2, Scene 1, although it's worth just seeing Act 1, Scene 4 as a prelude to that. And there's a key speech here around line 20 of Act 1, Scene 4, where Richard's talking with his followers. And this is, in fact, one of the few scenes where we do really see him interacting with those followers, which is one of the things he's most blamed for, that he allows these hangers-on to dictate his policy. And that's one of the reasons Bolingbroke says that he's challenging Richard is to get rid of these disreputable followers. So that scene needs to be probably played up as being rather frivolous and showing that that's something that Richard particularly enjoys, joking and interacting with. Bushy, Bagot and Green are the three big examples. And they might be shown on stage to be doing that at other times, even if there's not actually lines to suggest that. But here they talk about the exit of Bolingbroke as he's left the kingdom. And Richard talks about how he's heard that as he was observed, his courtship of the common people. So he was observed to sort of interact with the ordinary folk as he was leaving. And this is, of course, separating Richard out from Bolingbroke, that Richard finds this sort of amusing and ridiculous, what reverence he did throw away on slaves. So he's very disdainful of the common folk and thinks that they're irrelevant and doesn't understand why Bolingbroke should do anything to try and court their support. But of course, Bolingbroke is the master politician, the cynical, transactional character who knows that in order to perhaps sustain future power, he may well benefit from having the support of everyday people. So he woos poor craftsmen with the crafts of smiles, which again, presumably to Richard, is ridiculous. And he even ironically, one of the another sort of prophecies that seems to appear in the play, as were our England in reversion his, and he our subject's next degree in hope. So he seems to sort of hint that he knows that maybe people are thinking he might be the next king, but he seems to do that as a joke. I think he doesn't realise that that actually is what's going to happen. So that's a little key moment in his downfall, I think. But also what happens next is that just at the end of the scene, and this is a prelude to the scene we're about to see, a typical Shakespearean thing is to kind of give us a prior warning of what we're about to see. Bushy comes in with news that Gaunt is grievously sick and likely to die. And it's this, again, there's not that many scenes in which we see this, so this is quite important. Richard's reaction to the news that his uncle's about to die is frivolous and callous. Now put it, God, in the physician's mind to help him to his grave immediately. So I hope he dies soon. And his last line in the scene, pray God we make haste and come too late. So I hope we arrive just too late so that he's already dead. So it's the beginning of the following scene, really, and it's the beginning of the disaster that he's about to bring upon himself. So it's this callousness, frivolousness, lack of seriousness about the situation, selfishness, indulgence, treating other people as objects within his way or as aids to him rather than as individuals in themselves, and having no real feeling for his family at all, because this is his uncle he's talking about. But it leads directly into Act 2, Scene 1. And here we see probably the most famous moment in the play. Gaunt is talking with his brother York, and he then says another prophecy, methinks I am a prophet new inspired, and he makes this long speech, which is often quoted rather foolishly as a sort of depiction of the great beauty of Britain or the United Kingdom or England even, without realising that the whole thing actually is a speech to say that this was once what Britain was like, this great sceptred isle, but now it's been corrupted and sold out, farmed off, auctioned off by this corrupt king. And one of the things that this speech represents is that Richard is seen as being corrupt by people around him, but we don't see a lot of evidence of that in the play. It might be a weakness of the play, perhaps. It might be part of Shakespeare's deliberate attempt to shift our kind of sympathies more towards Richard as the play develops, because we don't really see him being particularly corrupt. He was callous and unkind in his attitude to Gaunt in the previous scene, but there was no sense that at this point that he was doing anything particularly bad on a governmental scale. There's no other evidence of him particularly. You're not seen, for instance, giving lands and titles to Bushy and Green and his other followers. However, Gaunt makes this elaborate speech in his dying breath almost. He's helped off stage in a few moments, and then we'll hear that he's died. We do get the entry before that, though, of the king. He does arrive just in time to confront Gaunt, and again, this is where we see this kind of unlikable attitude by Richard Howard. This early part of the play, the play is seeming to be set up to sort of favour Gaunt and Bolingbroke against Richard. That Richard's frivolous, unkind, selfish. The Queen appears on stage here. She's not mentioned in the first scene, although she could be there, or in the jousting scene. She could be there and often is placed on stage. But here she's specifically mentioned. He gets a line, but only one line, which could be part of the significance of the play. You could look at the play in terms of its depiction of female characters as being very much sidelined and powerless and responsive and reactive, but also suffering the consequences. The Duchess of Gloucester in the first part of the play. Now the Queen, who is always seen as being very sympathetic to Richard, but always seeming to suffer on his behalf. And then later, the Duchess of York, who stands up for her own son when her husband seems quite happy to see him quite probably executed for his treachery. Here the Queen just gets one line. She seems to show a little bit of sympathy, asks how Lancaster is. Richard seems in a jokey sort of mood, and he's often played like that in these early scenes, that he's joking around with his friends and companions. So how is it with aged Gaunt? So already he's kind of mocking him, maybe, old man. And Gaunt starts to say some of the things that he said in that previous speech. He starts to kind of give warnings, and he plays around, puns upon his own name, that he's Gaunt, as in his looks are sort of thinned and reduced. And Richard, again, is just amused by that. Can sick men play so nicely with their names? And so there's a bit of back and forth between Richard and Gaunt. And flattery is again mentioned. I'm flattering you. So there's this sense that you like being flattered, don't you, Richard? And again, that's one of his biggest weaknesses. But he does specifically attack Richard and say, I see thee ill. I can see that you are a problem. Landlord of England, thou art not king. So he in the things that he said while Richard wasn't on stage, he rather repeats here that you are sort of selling the kingdom away. You're not running the kingdom properly. And this is where Richard becomes vicious, and he calls him a lunatic, lean-witted fool, thinking that your illness can give you the privilege to argue. You can't speak to me like that. I'm the king. If you weren't my uncle, then I'd already have you executed. And that's really the end of Gaunt. But his final speech, a sort of final attack on Richard. So that's become much more vigorous from the early scenes. And now we're seeing Richard as somebody who's not respected, not seen as an effective leader, seen as corrupt, seen as favouring his followers. And we've had a little bit of evidence of that in the previous scene. But he here now is about to make his turning point mistake quite early in the play. And again, Richard's rather dismissive. Off goes Gaunt, and he says, and let them die, and that age and sullens have, for both hast thou. and both become the grave. So again, go off and die. I don't really care. And it's York who says, "Oh, don't take it too hard. He's ill." York's always trying to smooth things over, but almost immediately Northumberland comes back in with a slightly roundabout way of saying that Gaunt has died. And we get this great moment, which is one that you certainly could quote in essays, of Richard's frivolousness again. He starts to say a rather poetic sort of obituary for Gaunt. The ripest fruit first falls, so the people die young who are most ripe, most sort of developed and impressive. So the best people die young, sort of that kind of idea. So doth he. His time is spent, our pilgrimage must be. So, he's passed, but we have to carry on in our pilgrimage. But before he continues with this, it's got a couple of rhyming lines there. So much for that is the third line. Okay, enough of that. Let's move on. Let's think about something else. And that presumably is said to the amusement of his followers, who are often portrayed to be on stage with him at this point, that he finds it ridiculous. And he then immediately leaps into the rest of that speech where he says, right, I'll have everything that was Gaunt's, and I'll use it to help pay for these wars I want to wage in Ireland. So the huge mistake there is to do something that's actually unjust. And it's giving Bolingbroke an excuse to come back, to claim his inheritance and to claim the goods and lands and money that were rightfully his. And that allows Bolingbroke some reason to come back, and then once he's there, he'll be able to turn that into an attack on Richard's sovereignty. York tries to reason with him, and he makes a long speech, which he knows Richard loves a bit of rhetoric, and he tries to persuade him, saying, this is a mistake, don't do this. You shouldn't be taking all the goods and money. And Richard seems, uninterested. His response, just one line, why, uncle, what's the matter? As if he's not heard all the things, he's just spoken for 10 to 20 lines, as if he wasn't really listening, and it might be portrayed on stage that he literally wasn't. And so he kind of tries again and says, try to think about this before you do it. But Richard is not listening, and he says again, think what you will, we seize into our hands his plate, his goods, his money and his land. So that couplet there, just really rounding things off, it's a decisive moment. It's a decisive error in his tragedy. He's made the big mistake that's going to precipitate his downfall. And it's typical of, again, Shakespearean scenes, and in this play particularly, that Richard does not end the scenes very often. He has done a couple of times, but again here, it's somebody else who ends the scene, not him, which suggests that there's more going on, there's things going on behind his back, and some of the characters here talk, and they're already starting to plot and scheme and say, it's a bit tentative, they don't know whether to say anything or not, because what if you're not on our side? But eventually Ross tells Northumberland, be confident to speak, Northumberland, and then he says, Harry, Duke of Hereford, Bolingbroke, and a few others as well are mentioned, and they're all well furnished with 8 tall ships and 3,000 men of war, and making thither with due expedience. So they're on their way. So even now, almost immediately, before Gaunt is barely dead, Bolingbroke is already ready to come back. Things have been contracted there for dramatic purposes, no doubt, but it creates this sense that there's a real dissatisfaction with Richard. York has opposed him and been ignored. He's made a bad mistake here, and already people are starting to side with Bolingbroke and ready for Bolingbroke's return. And that happens very quickly in the play, a scene that we won't look at today, or in these scene-based videos, but by 2-3, Bolingbroke is back in England, And although he doesn't immediately claim the throne, the challenge is there. So Richard's made his big mistake, and these are the scenes in which we see him behaving in a rather more petulant, not just an indecisive, vacillating, and powerless way, but also a sort of petulant and silly and callous and cruel sort of way. And so in the first half of the play, it's very much set up that Bolingbroke's the hero who deserves our support, and that Richard is a weak and unlikable king. And that's how traditionally the play has been presented, as a sort of metaphor for the need for strong leadership. But that's a rather kind of conservative and right-wing reading of the play, and is not borne out by what happens later. And so other critics more recently have tended to say, yeah, well, there's also this sense that the poetry and majesty and beauty and interest of Richard make him a more appealing figure, particularly in the second half of the play, than the rather dull, mechanical and functional Bolingbroke.